I'll say briefly that before the modern version of explorers and colonialists and so on and so forth, because it's now we are still there where Columbus and those who came, perhaps is it Diego Cao, is it Columbus? Don't know who was first, but that modern version that starts in the 1500s, 1400s. Before they came over here, everything was very local, and economically, politically, and so on and so forth. There was nobody really seriously threatening to overthrow everything. And then, of course, came the Portuguese and the Spanish on behalf of everybody else in Europe, and so on. So America was found, and the world became really global. And in at the end of the 1880s or 1800s, the Germans ended up here because they were looking to be part of the game, and they ended up taking this part of the world. When they took Namibia, actually the Dutch were already here, even though the Dutch were not physically here, but the Dutch were here because the Dutch were in Cape Town and the Portuguese were in Luanda. So this piece in between was really, Luanda, or the Portuguese from Luanda have taken through influence, they've taken already almost half of more than half of the country. And the Dutch the Dutch and the English in the end from the south have taken them. So this was already almost a colony, even though formally it wasn't run from Europe. So why did the Germans formally take Namibia? They wanted to formalize some kind of structure where they could benefit somehow. Perhaps they're not very clear how they're going to benefit, but they were hoping to benefit economically, and they did somehow. At least they took the land in the end, after massacring almost everybody. They massacred the Hereros. There was genocide. You know about that, or sometimes it's still debated. It didn't happen really in the eyes of everybody, but it happened anyhow. And so capitalism was formally instituted, and therefore, which means that quite a chunk of the population, those who were not murdered, were alienated of their lands and fields, and they have to live differently now. They have to become laborers, they have to be poor, they have to be hungry people, they have to work in the places of others. And that means that they, in the end, they have to stand up and say something about this. That's on the one hand. So perhaps they have to be saying something about it as laborers, as workers between inverted commas. Then, on the other hand, other people also didn't like what was happening. So they also started to struggle in different ways, not as workers perhaps. So, sorry,
it's okay.
I didn't know that. I did left it on. Just switched off. So if you've read Namibian history, you'll know that what became Swapo later started in Cape Town, where a lot of other things were happening already. But it started very late, the end of the 50s. And if you know South African history, a lot had already happened before that, or at that time. Nelson Mandela, them were actually almost already in prison when Swapo started. And it started as OPO, whose main point of complaint was the migrant labor system in Namibia. Not apartheid, or at least not explicitly against apartheid, and not explicitly for independent Namibia. So it wasn't really the kind of winds of change that Macmillan spoke about. You know, it was not Nkrumah really, but in the end it became Nkrumah. So there were these different forces. So what the communists in Cape Town encouraged was half hijacked by the Pan-Africanists, perhaps with Washington's influence, who knows? And but different forces came together. Throughout, there were people who thought that it would be very important for a labor movement representing workers' views and workers, what they consider to be workers' interests, working class interests, to be part of the whole thing. And that's why perhaps that's one of the reasons why there were this kind of involvement. I was not born in Windhoek. I was born in rural Vamboland and became aware of what was going on in the country through my father, who was a laborer at the age of about 16, 17. He had to work from Vamboland to work on farms, which belonged to English people, Dutch perhaps sometimes, and German. To him, all these people were together. I mean, we're the same thing, really. They were white farmers, which means they were people who owned the land, and he had to work on their land. He didn't really think much that this was his land because he's from Vamboland, but it was actually land that was taken from people like his forefathers and so on. And I'm talking about that because my father told me a lot about what was going on, for example, in Europe. Actually, he worked for a Scottish guy, Mr. Douglas, who in 1938 volunteered for the war. And he told them not to go away. They were working at his farm near Kidmanshoop. He told them not to go away until he was back. But he never came back. My father, I think he thought this was very, very important. He kept on telling us that, you go to war, there's a chance that you won't come back. And he also, through his eyes, I started questioning why were the Germans fighting the English? They're actually one and the same thing, I thought, because they're all white, symbolically, in white symbolism. Not white like color, but they were rich. They were part of this rich something that was taking over the world, and whose whole aim was just to take over the world like that, like through taking over rich farmlands and farming on it. So, but my father said, no, but there are differences apparently there are differences between Germans and the English, because everybody had their own versions of taking over the world, so they were not really exactly the same. My father even made a song, the marvel, the irony of the English fighting the German, because they were more or less the same. Not only because we were white, but it's like they wanted to be first to oppress, So I always had this thing about specifically the workers and people having to work on farms and so on and so forth. And when I joined Swapo, and luckily I went to the Soviet Union, I had some time to listen a little bit more about what really was going on, and the version, at least this was the version of the Soviets, what's happening in the world and why it was the way it was. And what was it all about? What was America also? Because I never really had the time when I thought about America, it was the United Nations actually. When I was growing up, there wasn't really Washington, there was more New York. And the Americans to me also were actually black Americans, because even though I knew about Washington and Jefferson and those other first guys, to me, America became the symbol of the black man who was not the black man as we know him in Africa, you see. So, in the Soviet Union, these guys, Yuri, was telling me more about America that I didn't know. And of course, I have heard a bit now about Vietnam also, more about Vietnam. So I came to know America through the eyes also of the Soviet, but also through my own reading and so on and so forth, and through radio and TV now. I went to see the TV for the first time in Russia, because TV was banned here in South Africa and in Namibia until 1976. White guys in Namibia and South Africa were not allowed to see TV because it was going to be too dangerous. So in Russia, wonderfully, here was TV and here was Vietnam and so on and so forth. And as soon as I learned about America, the superpower, I also learned America, the vulnerable. I saw the Americans flying away from, the top of a tall building in Saigon, really in a very great hurry. So it was quite amazing to see this superpower, which the Soviets were very, very nervous about. But also, running away from Vietnam, Americans were even physically gigantic, and the Vietnamese were tiny and short and everything. So all these were, very, not only ironical, but somehow revealing that the world can be like this always, even physically can be like that there are always sharp turns and surprises. And okay, but the workers as versus the nationalists, because these two are now going together. Actually, in the Soviet Union, the leaders in my Swapo group said, no, don't get involved with these people. Don't listen even to what they were saying. So Swapo were writing in their writings that we, the Soviets, the Russians are our friends and so on. But the Swapo leaders actually said, no, be careful, don't touch these people and so on. That's what they told me. I thought, no, but these guys are really Moscow. But no, they were not. They were not. Don't believe this thing of Swapo before is not what. No, they were not. They were never like that. In my experience, the Swapo leaders were not really. They were not socialist. They were not communist. They were not even communist influenced. Not really. They were more Nkrumah, Nasser. They were perhaps the African aristocracy, the African noblemen who were angry that their lands were taken by the Portuguese noblemen and aristocrats and so on and so forth. Because even though the Swapos or the Swapo members and Swapo leaders who I met abroad and in exile, though they were not really they were not actually chiefs. They were not the African kings and chiefs whose lands were taken. There were many of them actually farm workers and so on. So they behaved as if they represented the African chiefs and so on and so forth. So there was that already at that time, that the people who were running Swapo, even though many of them were farm workers, former farm workers and so on, they were not a communist movement. They were not a socialist movement, in my view. They were not a workers' movement. Even though they started off, that's what stands in the history books, as a protest against Swanla and the migrant labor system. So perhaps there are questions, perhaps there are even more questions in what I'm saying now. What were they now really if they protested against this, but they were not really that? Because in my when we discuss politics when we were in Simferopol in the Soviet Union, the issues were not really about, but the workers are suffering, the workers are expropriated and so on. No, it was more about white and black. White people are everything. Racist, arrogant, and of course everything that they are, but not really rich exploiters. And if a black man could be rich and exploitative, that wasn't really the problem. The problem was more like white and black and foreign, coming all the way and taking away from here. That was the heart, I think, of Swapo. And it is still, I think, the heart. It is, but it's very funny then, because on the other hand, the foreign so-called investor who ends up being the foreign exploiters, the exploiter here, still ends up with the local rich or aspiring to be rich exploiter. So there is this love-hate thing that the politician, local politician who says they are fighting against the foreign one who comes and takes over. In the end, they end up together and they exploit and make sure that the worker, if he doesn't die, he at least keeps his position, his proper place in society. Partly, these were the reasons which took me out of Swapo. But partly also because of the many other things which went on in Swapo. Number one, the barely hidden tribal and racial and racist bias that goes on, which I couldn't live with because I have unfortunately gone past these things. I have perhaps met too many people who think like me, even though they were not tribally me, and think like me, even though they were not racially black. I said earlier on that I'm a black person. I meant to say that I'm black in my upbringing, not black, also black like this, but poor, very local, and all these kind of things. But I'm also not black, really, because I also have the way of seeing beyond the color. So in that sense, I didn't go along with what went on in Lubango in the late 80s, the second half, especially after not late 80s, after the late 70s, from 76 onwards. The murdering of a number of people in Swapo simply because there was tribal bias against them. The murdering of especially the people from the south and the center of the country, simply because they were supposed to be spies, and they were spies because they were not Ovambos. If you ask anybody from Swapo right now and you say, but why were these people spies? And how did Swapo find out that they were spies? The answer will be, but because there's no war without spies. And if there's no war without spies, who was going to be spies in Swapo? These people who don't belong. And why don't they belong? Because they're not Ovambo. Why do non-Ovambos not belong?
Do you want to ask? Well, what we were... This brings up a point which we wanted to touch on, because everybody is saying that Minister Gengo is going to run for the presidency. Of course, he hasn't said so, because that doesn't happen. Minister Gengo is not Ovambo. But no. Prime Minister Angula, who we also think is going to... I believe he didn't say he was going to run. He said if he's nominated, he won't refuse it. I believe that was his statement. what do you make? I mean, this is side note from other things, but this just brings it up in my mind. What do you make of this? What do you think is going to happen in 2 years? 2 years.
Why don't you ask me to tell you what's going to happen in the COD and in other parties? Of course, you also have that. You mentioned it, so don't get into that. I'm putting it as an answer. It's part of an answer.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you end up interviewing everybody about Swapo, even those who are not Swapo, because you think that's what matters. But anyhow, you are asking what's going to happen?
Because this seems like it's a bit of an internal identity crisis in Swapo, because it's always been identified as the party for the Ovambo-speaking people. But Minister Gengov, a rather popular figure within Swapo, is Damara. And we've read articles through the papers. I wonder, the saying, is he going to run? No, he hasn't started yet, blah, 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 blah.
A big part of it is window dressing. But it's not all window dressing. It's window dressing because Swapo is really seriously an Ovambo, almost tribal, but also not really only tribal, because the Ovambos are not only now a tribe. He will know because he's a historian. It's not only a tribe, it's also now very much the middle class. So it's a middle class that is masquerading as a tribe, because in Africa there are tribes. So many people in Swapo, if they say, but we are Ovambo, they have already finished their statement. But they are just pretending. They are something else. They are people who aspire to be rich, and they are people who are really modern rich people. But they say, we are Ovambo. Some even say, you have to vote for us because we are Ovambo. But they also have to say, we are the modern kind type. We are the real modern Namibian. And therefore they have to say, we accept everybody. Kynkob definitely is part of us. And Kynkob cannot be anything else. He has to be here, because here is also his identity. Also, this is the only successful way of getting to the top. If Kynkob wants to be president, he will have to be voted in his view. I'm not saying really this is how it ought to be, or this is how it is going to be. Anyhow, it can be different. Don't be surprised if it turns out to be different. But Kynkob in common sense says that if Kynkob is going to be president, he will have to be voted for by the Ovambos. And if he has to be voted for by the Ovambos, he has to be a leader of Swapo. So even if he hates it, he has to pretend to love it.
Thank you.
Can you go into the formation of the COD, why there's a need for it?
Because you were, at independence, you were part of Constituent Assembly, right? And which was chaired, if I remember correctly, by Minister Gengu. And then you had a Swapo position as Minister of Tourism, right? Minister of Agriculture and Tourism, for a couple of years, until the late 90s when you had a break with Swapo. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because from what we read, it also had to deal with President Nuyoma, your difficulties with Swapo.
My difficulties with Swapo were not with Sam Nuyoma per se. They were with the things which happened in Lubango. They were also with the things that happened even before that, even with my background from what I picked up in the Soviet Union, on Robben Island. But, specifically speaking, the way that Swapo leaders, therefore, Swapo, didn't really mean what it said. Actually, if I have to say it in 5 words, that was just all about that. what was happening in the late 1990s was that after signing onto a constitution 10 years earlier, which said that there would be a 2-term presidency, without any debate, without any, proper explanation why it was changing, Swapo was now saying that no, but the constitution must be changed so that we can have a 3rd term. Swapo never meant there to be a 2nd term. A limitation on the presidency, really. That's what it said. And I didn't like it. I didn't like it also because many other things that Swapo people said, they only said it flippantly, and they took a lot of people for granted. And that's why I didn't like it. And I also didn't like the fact that that nobody seemed to be bothered, including me myself. I wasn't just getting where I could make my point. I could say loudly enough that I was bothered. So one of the reasons actually was that I wanted to say very loud that I was bothered. But it didn't help. Actually, after my resignation from Swapo, no, I haven't resigned then from Swapo, but after my resignation from my job in London as High Commissioner, I was traveling. I was in Cape Town at a party. A friend of mine who was a South African politician, prominent South African politician then, had a party, New Year's party in 1999. And there was a guy there from Zimbabwe who made a joke about Namibia and about Sam Nujoma and the 3rd term, and how not even a fly in Namibia dared complain, you see. And I was there, and so which I did was really very, very little. It didn't make any waves. In the region, people really felt that, no, there you have Namibia and Swapo and everybody, and the chief says he will not bother himself with the constitution. He was going to take one more term, and not even a single one said anything. So that was your Namibia. He stood there, he said, that's your Namibia. And I didn't even want to say, no, but a small little fly tried to say, but we can also complain about that. Actually, we ought to be. What I said was actually we ought to be complaining about this. Not necessarily only because the 3rd term was a bad thing, but because we just only 10 years before, we said we're binding ourselves to a 2nd term. And if we can't bind ourselves to this, what is it that we can bind ourselves to, really? So that was actually my question. And that is still, I think, the question in many other respects in Namibia and in Swapo also. Even the Keinkop thing, making Keinkop vice president in the first place was trying to manipulate and to appease a number of factions within Swapo, within Namibia, and also internationally. It was trying to tell the CIA, to tell America and to tell contemporary world that we are part of you, and there are important principles and so on, and one needs to tie themselves to it, including important international agreements and so on. So we can also keep them, and we're prepared to keep them. Therefore, we are going to have a 4-person leadership on top that we are going to make very important and very, we're going to bind ourselves to this. And the president, the first one will be the president, the second one will be the vice president. And when the president steps down or retires, the vice president is going to be the second one. And it will be in that order, So at least there won't be too much of rocking the boat. There will always be 4, a hierarchy of 4. You will know the first one, and also the second, and also the third, and also the fourth. So at least, if you can work out these 4 guys. You see?
Yeah.
That's how ready we are to play to the fears of Washington and London and all those guys, and even Moscow and Beijing. You see, there's also Beijing, but SOP.
Yeah. And now, the Congress of Democrats.
The Congress of Democrats.
What motivated you not to just leave politics, but to begin your own?
The Congress of Democrats was not really part of the agenda that I just explained. I didn't really aim to have something called the Congress of Democrats that time. And if you follow the history until now, you can see it also, perhaps. You can just see that there were many other people who were left out of Swapo, who had more or less the same intentions as Swapo, anyhow. And these people sort of congregated or stormed together, and the Congress of Democrats was formed. There were people who were saying, this is not the time. I felt it has to be the time, perhaps also because there was this, but what I was going to do now if this is not the time. But perhaps it wasn't really the time, because the Congress of Democrats didn't have a chance of being any much different, even from what Swapo was. Because there were not a lot of people in Namibia who could be different. And that was necessary. You know, you needed to have people, and many of them, quite a number of them, who could say, but no, look, we definitely, who could clearly say what Swapo was and spell it out and understand it, and therefore say, if we are going to be different, we are going to be like this. In the Congress of Democrats, you found the same kind of biases. You found the same kind of ambitions like we had in Swapo. Only some pretending that no, because many people were non-Ovambo, so they were not going to be as stupid as the Ovambos. Because those are some of the tribal biases that you always have. The Ovambos arrested everybody else because they were spies, and they were spies because they were not Ovambo. And the new people in the Congress of Democrats, they were not going to be stupid, and they were clever because they were not Ovambo, and the converse is true. So, but that's not the only thing that the people who could be different, the people lower than the middle class in Namibian terms, would rather be led by the middle class. They can't confidently shout their own song. So they would rather keep quiet and be led by I don't want to say by us, but they would rather be led by the likes even of, or by the likes of the Pohambas and the Uyamos, and others, many others who are actually perhaps now hiding behind these people, but who are actually now pushing their own bit. The people who are now getting into agreements and so on and so forth with the big American companies, oil companies including, because apparently there's a lot of oil. There must be a lot of oil around Namibia.
Now, we went to UNAM and talked with a lot of students there about, because voter turnout among young people in Namibia is terrible. I mean, America is not much better. Actually, I think we're worse. But and most of them don't vote because they don't feel that any party really represents. I mentioned the main ones, your party, the Swapo, the RDP, and they describe the other parties as Swapo light, like the beer, and What do you see as the best way for your party, or I'll even just use the phrase the not Swapo parties, to tap into the born frees, who don't see Swapo as a loyalty sort of thing, which a lot of older Namibians do, still see Swapo sort of as the liberation movement, and even though they haven't done too much, give them time, they freed us. in 1990. What do you see as the best way to appeal to the born frees who are not voting?
I'll say, unfortunately, in my reading of history and in my following what has happened over the last few years, real serious movements have only happened after some real persuasion. And this includes ideological persuasion, some kind of identity persuasion, and not just superficial identity. So it mustn't just be it mustn't be fashion. It must get deeper than, if you want to be in nowadays, you have to vote Swapo. People must be persuaded further than that. They must really see that but there is something that really concerns them. So if in South Africa in the 80s and the 90s, the fires were really burning, and everybody felt the fires, and therefore they decided, and they were all the time running in the streets, and it was bad, and they pushed over that government, including actually the so-called National Party guys who were running the country. They could see clearly that this is now the time to, and they did it very, very cleverly, nicely, so much so that not much changed actually. In Namibia, these people that you're talking about, my point of desperation comes always when I talk to the students at UNAM, to the born frees, and to those who were born in the 80s and also in the 70s. They seem not to understand a thing of what went on even at the time of their birth, not to say what went on before, shortly before they were born. And therefore, I don't see them seriously taking part in something that will change the situation, unless, except as a way of like fashion, like CODs, like I like the way they sign, or I like the slogans or whatever, unless at that level. I don't see anybody trying to have a real proper understanding of what's going on, and even if it's perhaps wrong, but like a real belief in how did things happen, why is it happening like this. Nobody understands, nobody knows anything. The other day I was sitting with somebody who's a prominent member of the COD Youth League, and as we sat there at the cafe drinking something, there was a TV on this side, and Fidel Castro came onto the screen. Oh, wapura kujo bangu tepa tapanga pi. Oh, okay.
Fidel Castro came on the TV.
That's right, and he took my attention. And so this guy looked and said, "Who's that?" And it was just like, I was like a balloon that was just pricked with a needle like this. So if you can have anybody in this part of the world, let alone in this part of the world, in Namibia, who is even, who dares to say they're involved in some kind of politics, and they wouldn't identify Fidel Castro when they see him on the screen. Not just Fidel Castro, the face, but Fidel Castro, the symbol, Not in American terms, but Southern African terms, Especially Fidel Castro, because he's not a black man. But he symbolizes actually that kind of black that I talked about at the beginning. So that really makes you despair of the UNAM and the Polytechnic people. And if they cannot identify Fidel Castro, what hope does the grade 12 and grade 11, those kids now, and that is also that is what Swapo did. And it's partly because even the people there up there, but you will say, but how can we blame this all on Washington? But I can tell you that the big strings or the big string pullers at international level, I'm sure I have secretly hoped it will all turn out like this, because then you won't really have serious struggles and serious revolutions around here, because the kind of people that will get involved are just these kind of people who don't really know about. Today they hear that, it looks like the Damaras now want to be. They will fight about these petty things, and they will never understand what's going on in the world. They can't really come to grips with things. But also locally, the people in Swapo, the leaders, they feel very safe if they can continue to try to explain to everybody else here how important it was and how heroic they were and so on. And so this is the kind of stuff that you have now, that you have people who actually don't even have time to identify Fidel Castro. They still have to listen to the heroic stories and to, how this may So.
Yeah, what do you make of the new Heroes Acre that was built?
Oh, it's not new. Okay.
Actually, yeah, new as in it was built 10 years ago. But we went there, and also it's sort of falling apart. It was made with very cheap materials, and there's a lot of rust. And we also drove past. We hadn't even heard of it, except we accidentally got lost in Okahanja. There's also a museum built there as well.
Yes. By the roadside, so that everybody can see it. A lot of things perhaps are interesting here. One of them is that people now here locally say that, but you Chinese, the only problem with you is that, you have special products for Africa, and you have other products for Britain and Germany and the USA. So if you come here now, if we can now say this in terms of the Euros Ecker, you make cheaper Euros Eckers for Namibia instead of, compared to what you make for America. Your relationship, in other words, the Chinese relationship with GM is different from their relationship with GRN and the relationship with the Namibian on the street and everything else. So why do we make a Heroes Ecker that's breaking apart in 5 years since it was built? Or because our new friends don't take us seriously? But we also don't understand this Heroes Ecker thing. It's not part of our culture, if there's our culture. And also the people who are pushing for a Heroes Ecker, they don't hope perhaps to have a long, they just want to persuade now. So then they don't really mind. They don't want to put up, like marble that will take generations and, 10 generations to stay. So they want to persuade, for the purposes of next elections, everybody to know that there's heroes, and the heroes will be in the Heroes Ecker, and so on and so forth. It's actually for the next 2 elections.
I think we only have time for one last question. It's about 11:30, just before.
Oh, okay.
I must actually apologize, because like we said briefly over there, seriously, these kind of things, perhaps even my kind of approach and talk will only make sense once we have spoken half a day, because then you sort out, perhaps you see that, because there are a lot of things that's going in my head, and I'm throwing them together also. But we don't have enough time. I wish you could stay longer and we could
I have one last question. Does the unknown soldier look familiar to you?
Oh, the Sam Nujoma thing. Yeah, but I don't know who decides on the features of the physical features. Is it Sam Nujoma or is it somebody else who wants to fool both the people and Sam Nujoma? So, yes, because Sam Nujoma wants, perhaps people see that this guy is happy being portrayed everywhere. And the people are sussed, they're lured if we do it this way, and they are somehow happy if things don't look like they're going to change. Sam Nujoma is appeased. They're happy. They are happy to appease Sam Nujoma, not to please him, not to appease him, to please him. And they also feel that if Sam Nujoma is pleased, most probably he will please them also. And they also somehow identify the person who needs to be pleased is Sam Nujoma, which is also interesting. Perhaps it's not really Sam Nujoma. Perhaps it's somebody else. So people believe that Sam Nujoma pulls all the strings in Namibia. Yeah. People also believe that it's Sam Nujoma who must be pleased. And so those two things. But I really don't know. Perhaps you must interview Sam Nujoma before you go, if you haven't done so.
We tried.
We got really close, but he's out of town.
Yeah.
We were going to, but he...
Why didn't you say...
We met with Minister Gengo, and at the end we said, would you be able... I know he lives next door to you. Would you be able to introduce us to him? And he says he's at his farm up north somewhere, in, I think Otavi or something.
Yes, you should have asked somebody else. Why?
He's in Mozambique, actually.
Oh, he's in Mozambique.
Yeah.
But you did it only now. You should have done it three months before.
We have been calling Minister Gengo for months and months and months and months.
But it's not Minister Gengo who can take you to Sam Nujoma.
Well,
who takes us?
The easiest way, we thought it would be the easiest way. Minister Gengo went to our college.
He was in the U.S. studying.
When he studied in the U.S., he went to our school. So we tried to use that connection. But the problem was we got lost. We got lost in the secretary of bureaucracy, and the only way we actually got him was we saw him at a restaurant, and we sent our waiter with a note. We're those American students who have been calling you nonstop. And unfortunately, we only a few days ago got to talk to him, and by that point, Sam Nujoma was already in Mozambique. We asked Minister Gengo if we can get at least a telephone number for Sam Nujoma, so even though we won't be able to use a camera, we can at least ask him some questions and get his take on it.
Bernard, next time when you come to a place like this one, a person like Kankov, even if no matter how close he seems to be like to Sam Nujoma, when there is this whole thing of tribe, Damara, and I tell you, it's between inverted commas because it's always slightly something else. It's not really tribe like you hear about tribe or you read about tribe. But all these things mean that it's not Hage Kainkob who can bring you to Sam Nujoma. But actually, the other way around is true. You can go to Hage Kainkob through Sam Nujoma, but definitely not to Sam Nujoma through Hage Kainkob. Those old, real Sam Nujoma guards, Doze, Ecker, and even the people around Pohamba now, and even the people like, Pohamba's advisors, all those guys who are there, because they were placed there by Sam Nujoma. You can go to Sam Nujoma through them. Sam Nujoma he hasn't gone to school. But I can tell you how he has gone to school. Really, all the guys, all those graduates, including American graduates, are of his making. And he put them there, many of them literally, but many of them also symbolically, he put them there. And they will nobody around Sam Nujoma will be positively influenced by anything coming from Hage Kainko's way. anything that looks like it's coming through the Office of African Code, that already means no. That's how it is.
So what do you suggest
if you come back?
Well, if we let's say wanted to make a phone call from America,
Yeah, you call.
and at least ask him.
Yeah, call a guy called Tuliameni Kalomo, or anybody, or Kwaita Shanyangana, who's Pohamba's advisor. I think, no, he's the spokesperson at State House. Call Tatekulu, who was the Swapo Elders Council secretary until recently.
Wait,
Kanana Hishon.
Yeah, we already talked with him. He couldn't
get us.
He put us in touch with Toivo Yatoivo, who we had the first half of the conversation last night. Tomorrow night we have the second half. But Toivo, I don't think likes him very much. They don't. From what we've heard, they do not get along very well.
Yeah.
But
So.
All right, we're gonna ask him because we.
Last question.
Yeah, this is final question. Then we'll get out of your hair.
Do you see my wife?
Yes, she seems anxious.
Was Mr. Toivo set up?
Toivo.
Yeah.
By history or by individuals?
By individuals.
There's just
rumors.
There's a rumor that
he was set up for.
As in
his documents were left.
Put
in his bag.
Sam Nujoma had come back to Namibia and was immediately deported back.
Yes. I don't believe that.
You don't believe that rumor?
That he got arrested because of that?
By Sam Nujoma.
I don't think so.
Incriminated.
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
Okay. I think the Sam Nujoma thing, even the coming back here, I think was just. It was a stupid thing. No, not a stupid thing. It was just one of those things that they're not. It's not 100% clarified. It was 75% of it.
Yeah. Okay.
The rest, there was some kind of agreement. I think there were many things, including not belief, but some kind of what is it? What's the term? What is another word? But it was, yes. It was supposed to be so. People thought it was, that's how it was done. Yeah. The Mondlanes, Mondlane was then dead already, but almost everybody was in prison. The Kenyatas and so on, they all went to prison because that's what happened and all kinds of things. Yeah. That's what I heard people say in Swapo. That there was a lot of pressure for Sam Nujoma to fly to Namibia. So actually, I understand Sam Nujoma was prepared to go to prison when he came to Namibia.
Well, let me pull this off. But thank you very much for talking to us.